This is the first ever Right Proper War Correspondents. This is a spin-off of the Brooklyn Brewery series that we partnered with RISC partnered with the Brooklyn Brewery to put on a very similar event. And we had the opportunity, knowing Sebastian, I took his RISC course. I'm a freelance cameraman. And I spent about 2 weeks in Yemen with Ben this summer. So it all kind of coalesced into what you're seeing here tonight, which is Right Proper War Correspondents. Big thanks for RISC for coming down. Lily, where's Lily? There she is. Lily also administers RISC with Sebastian, and if it wasn't for this type of course, people like me wouldn't have combat medical training, and I wouldn't be able to go places like Yemen with Ben without being able to feel good or safe or comfortable about it. We're gonna play a short video, which is kind of a quick testimonial. They haven't seen it yet, so it's a surprise that Kevin, who's in the back, is one of our camera operators, helped edit and produce alongside me. So we're gonna start with that. And I have to use an app, because I'm a millennial.
I think most people don't realize what goes on behind the story. People working in extremely difficult situations, especially with freelancers with little backing and not a whole lot of money. And I look back and think of the mistakes that I made, and it's scary. You know, could have been me, could have been any of us.
You've got to really understand how to protect each other, to be able to help your colleague and for them to know how to help you is critical.
The advantage of RISC is having it primarily hands-on, right? There's some lecture, there's some videos and some discussions, but really it's the hands-on classes or practicums that are the most valuable.
That muscle memory, those are things that I still have 4 years later in my mind, and I have that instinct.
And I think RISC, it's a lot more than a medical course. It's a close group of friends, it's a giant network of people that you can trust, that you know that take their jobs seriously. And the work we do is unique. We understand how difficult it is, so we look out for each other and help each other out when we can.
Not only do you have a community, but you've got a community of people who have a base knowledge that could save your life.
All the proceeds from tonight are going to benefit RISC. So thank you for coming. And thank you for the people who paid a little extra money at the door. That's all going to train journalists who are in the audience and journalists like me who need this, who can't pay for it because news organizations are not sending us to these courses by their own volition. So to start off the evening, I'd like to welcome Sebastian Junger to the stage. We'll have you right here. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Sebastian to introduce Ben.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I was very moved by the video. It was incredible. It's interesting to see something that you've done through someone else's eyes. It's very moving. So we're very lucky to have Ben Anderson with us tonight, extraordinary journalist. I think a very, very brave person. And clearly, when you talk to him, someone who's extremely sensitive to the stories that he's covering, which is what you want in a person. The combination of bravery and sensitivity is precious and rare. And we definitely have that with us tonight in Ben. So please give a warm welcome to our friend Ben. So I think we're going to start with a clip to get things rolling.
There are piles of rocks everywhere, although no one is sure exactly what they mean.
I feel like I should let people recuperate for 30 seconds.
It scares me more watching it then than it did at the time.
Tell me about what that felt like to shoot that, to be in that situation, to have the bombs go off. Like, just take us through it emotionally a little bit.
And I think at that point in the war in Afghanistan, the big fear was always losing your legs. I mean, you know, people think when you do this for a living, you're an adrenaline junkie and you do it for thrills. I don't find it thrilling at all. It's more like an endurance test than a thrill. It's not thrilling at all, and coming that close to the big fear of losing your legs, it was terrifying at the time. But you have to keep on going, because we were in the middle of a lot more there. I mean, those Marines were duct taping their testicles to their stomachs, or duct taping their testicles up, knowing there was a good chance they were going to get their legs blown off, but wanting to be able to one day have children. That's how bad it was. So, you know, the reason for going wasn't the thrill of danger. The reason for going was just to show how bad it had become. You know, you see that one guy walking like a ballerina because he's walking in the footsteps of the minesweeper in front of him, because, you know, stepping 6 inches either side of the footprint that the guy in front of him left could mean stepping on an IED. That's how bad it was.
So they didn't know if it was pressure detonated or command detonated. In other words, there are some bombs that are triggered by you stepping on them or driving over them. There's some that are triggered because someone's watching you, and this is how I got blown up. They push the clacker right when they think they're going to kill you. So they were worried about both.
And well, the command detonated bombs don't have metal in the ground,
Right.
which is why the metal detector didn't find anything.
Right.
Even though a choke point where several alleyways or routes meet is where there are always IEDs, especially in a place as bad as Sangin. So they were sure they were there, but there was nothing to do but carry on. And that area had been cleared by the Brits, and the Brits had lost more soldiers in one IED incident than anywhere else in the entire war. And when the US Marines took over, they decided to give up that area and then realized that was a mistake and had to retake it. So that was the operation, to retake land, which had already been cleared, underlying the futility of the operation.
Did you know the guys pretty well at that point?
Yeah, that was, I mean, most of the times I've been out with Marines. I love going out with Marines because they're very happy to be filmed, and they don't change their behavior because you're there with a camera. It seems they're given more license than anyone else. They're allowed to swear and be politically incorrect and show the full violence of modern war, whereas others are a lot more restrictive. These guys were different. They'd had a very bad experience with a British reporter before, where he'd written about one of their colleagues who tripped onto an IED and basically had his face blown off. And he wrote about this and you know, put it down in his notepad and put it in his story, but the guy's family hadn't known how he'd been killed exactly. So they hated him for that. And then I turned up, another British reporter, and they made it absolutely clear they didn't want me there. So this was one of the most difficult trips I've had. And on my first day there, one of them said to me, if you make us look like baby killers, we're going to come after you. And I said, look, there's an easy way for me not to make you look like baby killers. Don't kill babies. You know,
Did he laugh?
No, he didn't laugh. They didn't laugh at all. And they went out on 2 or 3 patrols every day. And because they walked so slowly, it would take 7 hours to walk 2 kilometers in a circle around the base, just to show presence. And so I would go out on 1, 2 patrols every single day, and eventually that won me a bit of respect, and some of them started to engage with me and talk to me.
That must have taken an emotional toll on you as well. I mean, it had to have, right? Like, how did you feel after that, after you came home?
That one was tough, because at that point, before I joined Vice, I used to work completely alone. So, you know, the relationships you have with people make or break the trip. So being somewhere where you feel really unwanted and distrusted, and having that nearly happen, that was one of the more difficult ones. And I've had a couple of friends of you know, as most of us have now, have stepped on IEDs, and one lost both his legs. One, on his first trip to Afghanistan, lost both of his legs and an arm. So, you know it could happen to any one of us very, very easily.
I mean, I feel like we could talk for the whole hour just about that clip, but we have some more great clips to show you guys. In case you're not sufficiently traumatized by this, we're going to try it again. So we're going to queue up the next clip.
Push up and try to get eyes on this first compound right there. All right.
So that was Operation Mushtarak, the invasion of Marjah in 2010, the biggest operation since the war began, the first test of Obama's new policy in Afghanistan. The fighting that day lasted, I think, about 6 or 7 hours before the Marines could run into a building and actually be protected. The Marines I was with, one of whom is here tonight, I thought the plan was to slowly approach Marjah from the outside and fight the Taliban over the course of 2 or 3 days. That group, their job was to get dropped into the middle of the town on day one at about 4 a.m. and slowly fight their way out. And because of the new policy to prevent civilian casualties, courageous restraint, they couldn't shoot until they were shot at or saw an undeniable hostile act being committed. The Taliban cottoned onto this straight away, so we stood on the edge of that field watching fighters get dropped off in buildings all around us with their weapons covered in blankets, setting up the perfect ambush, and there was nothing the Marines could do about it. And when the firing started, we ran and dived into that ditch, and the Marines either side of me got hit. The one who you see with his leg bleeding was the medic. So their medic was taken out within the first 15 minutes.
So the first conflicts you were in, were they with Western military forces or not?
No, the first, I spent some time with I'm always concerned about depressing people in these talks. There's a slightly funny story. My first conflict zone, you can go to lots of conflict zones without seeing conflict.
You can. Yeah.
So we snuck from Thailand into Burma and hooked up with the Shan State Army, who were led by Yord Serk, the world's most wanted opium trafficker. We managed to join up with the rebels and film in their camp, and we avoided these Burmese military posts. And we thought we might catch a glimpse of Yord Serk if we were lucky. And one day he turned up in a pickup, of 4 or 5 pickups, with lots of armed guards with AKs and RPGs. And he walked over and he said, "Are you the British reporter?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "We're playing badminton now, England versus Burma." And he had a badminton court in the middle of this guerrilla camp in the jungle. And we played badminton for several hours. And I remember thinking then, I can't believe I'm getting paid for this. This is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. No, he won. I didn't let him win. He did actually genuinely win. I would have let him win.
Well, for me, my first conflict was Sarajevo during the Civil War. I was in Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, all these conflicts that were basically civil wars. And they were being fought by militias or very, very unprofessional armies. And I wasn't with a regular army until 2005 with the Americans in Afghanistan. And I'd been in Afghanistan 10 years earlier in 96. And it was a very, very different experience. And what did you think it was going to be like? And then what was the reality like for you to be with the American military? I was prepared for all kinds of censorship and all that. It didn't really happen. But I'd be curious how you felt about that transition.
So the first serious conflict was Liberia with Tim. At one point surrounded by hundreds of child soldiers, high, drunk child soldiers, 12, 13, 14 years old, with snakes around their necks. And I'd got a job at the BBC, and I thought I'd landed at the BBC. It was the best media organization in the world, and I'd landed right at the top. And suddenly you're in Liberia, surrounded by 300 or 400 child soldiers. And I remember thinking, I'm on my own here. There's nothing the BBC can do to help. And it could easily be total chaos. My first experience with Western forces was with the British military in Afghanistan. And I was very lucky that someone senior had said to the guys on the ground, let this guy see everything. Had it have not been for that, I would have been heavily restricted. And there was actually a meeting where they'd killed some civilians by mistake. And I was filming the meeting where they apologized and make a condolence payment. And I had to wrestle my way into that room because they tried to prevent me from filming it. So I went out with the Brits a few times, did a film which was critical, but not overly so. And it was the soldiers themselves thought it was fair. But the British Ministry of Defence wouldn't let me out with the soldiers ever again. Then I went out with the US Marines, and there's a clip we're going to show later on of a similar payment, a similar meeting with condolence payments and apologies for civilian casualties. And I said I'd like to film that meeting, and they actually came to get me and take me to the meeting. They were incredible. And actually, one other funny-ish story, there was a very good Taliban sniper in Marjah who was causing all kinds of problems, and the Marines thought they'd identified roughly where he was. So the commanding officer, a guy called Captain Sparks, got 20 of his best men, and they ran in a big semicircle and climbed onto a roof just to wait for this guy to get picked up, and they were going to kill him. And I said, can I go with you? And he said, sure, you can go with me. And I was laying on the roof as close as I am to you now with a guy called Blancet, who saw a van come to pick up one of these snipers and opened fire. And he said, there they are. And he claims he hit him. He said, he's fucking dead. I hit that guy right in the fucking head. And I'm filming this, 3 feet away. And they're high-fiving and hugging each other. And I couldn't believe I was allowed to film all this. At the end of the trip, Captain Spark said to me, I would never ask you not to show anything, but if there's anything that's going to get my guys in trouble, can you just warn me what it might be? So I said, sure, there's this, and there's this, and there's this. And I told the story about Blancet and the sniper, and he said, that's fine. He said, that's what we do. That's what we were sent here to do. And then Blancet himself came up to me, and he said, that day with the sniper, I had a helmet and sunglasses on, didn't I? I said, yeah, you did. I said, I don't think anyone will be able to identify you. And he said, that's what I'm worried about. Could you put my name on the bottom of the screen? So that was the difference between the US Marines and every other group I've been out with. And the British Ministry of Defence are terrible. You're given a minder. They'd rather you just film them repairing schools and handing out sweets to children and pretend there's no fighting happening at all. I've had a terrible time with them.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was prepared for in 2005 with my first embed with U.S. forces. I've never been with the Brits or anybody else. And I was amazed and really impressed that the Americans were just like, look, if you're willing to walk with us, if you're willing to take the same risks we're taking, if we don't have to carry your shit, if you will carry all your stuff, and we just basically don't have to babysit you, just do whatever you want.
And just show how bad it is for us.
Yeah.
And the politics of it, we don't really care.
That's right.
And actually, we probably agree with you.
Yeah. Right.
About how badly it's going,
right.
And the pointlessness of it. But just show how bad it is for us, and you can do whatever you want.
In my film Restrepo, there was no political content in there, and I was criticized by people for making a film about the war that didn't have any political discussion about the rights and wrongs of the war. And I said, if the soldiers themselves had discussed the politics of the war, it would have been in the film. They just didn't. They just didn't do it. It's a volunteer army. They're over there because they volunteered, and it just never came up. Did the Marines, did they discuss the sort of bird's eye view of the war at all, or not?
At the time, not really. Since then, quite a lot, especially when Fallujah has fallen to ISIS, or Sangin and Marjah have just fallen to the Taliban. Then there's a lot of discussions. And at the beginning people always say Afghanistan is the longest war in America's history. We kind of took the first 7 or 8 years off. There wasn't much going on. There wasn't much presence outside of Kabul. But when the war was first taken seriously, 2008, 2009 onwards, you had some believers. People who thought the Taliban could be defeated, the Afghan security forces could be trained to be good enough. That didn't last that long. And now I don't know anybody who still believes those goals were ever achievable, and certainly haven't been achieved.
All right, so we're gonna, if you guys can do another clip, we're gonna do the third clip. You ready?
We're really sorry for what happened yesterday.
It pains us all here to know what you must be going through right now with the loss that you just suffered.
That was $10,000 for the guy's sister and 3 kids killed. And the Marine who you see, you don't actually see him talk in that clip, but the guy who's very gaunt with the shaved head is, in the book I described him as the most idealistic Marine I'd ever met, in the best sense of the word. He was a massive fan of Christopher Hitchens, thought this was the fight of our generation, had gone out there thinking, he was doing the best thing he could possibly do, and I think that really broke him having to do that. And full credit to them for, I asked to be at that meeting, and they actually came. They could have easily said to me, something's happening somewhere else, and not had me not film that meeting.
He seemed really, really affected by it, the Marine commander. Am I right?
They all were. Yeah. I mean, they were up until that point. There had been no civilian casualties. Another company arrived, and they were the ones that killed the 4 people by mistake. But yeah, in particular, the very idealistic Marine. I think that changed everything for him.
What were the circumstances of the killing? How did that mistake happen?
I think someone had fired an RPG at them, and a young Marine had fired a rocket back and hit the wrong house. And the civilians of Marjah had actually been told to hide in their houses until the fighting was over, and then the Marines would tell them to come out and it would be safe. So they said, we were doing exactly what you told us to do. We were hiding in our houses waiting. and you killed my family. And Marjah, by the way, is probably, well, almost, sorry, that's Sangin, not Marjah, is probably back in Taliban hands now. It sounds like it fell about 3 weeks ago to the Taliban.
Did it affect you? It must have made you sad, that situation. I mean, does that stuff seep into your feelings?
I mean, at the time, you can't have too many feelings because you have your job to do and you have to record it. That meeting actually led to one of the biggest regrets I have. And afterwards, the family led me to the room next door where the 4 bodies were, with a sheet over them, and blood was seeping through the sheet. And they lifted up the sheet and told me to take a picture of the bodies. And I thought I was being polite by refusing. And I said, thank you, I've already, intruded too much, and I walked out, and I really regret not taking those pictures, just because they wanted, the full horror of their story to be shown, and I didn't get it.
I mean, I think that's probably a very common reaction. I mean, I've also been in a situation presented with quite a number of dead bodies, and it's really not clear to yourself which is more respectful, to document it because it's a tragedy and tragedies have to be documented, or to not take the photograph, which taking a photograph of someone else's tragedy can also feel exploitative, right? And this is not what's going on in their minds. This is just your own internal debate. And I think that's the central debate of journalism in some ways, is thank God journalism happens, because otherwise, these things would be going on in a black void and no one in the world would know. But on the other hand, the very act of it can certainly feel exploitative and even kind of predatory. But then if you sort of think, okay, well then I won't do it, no one should do it, then that's also bad. And you must have thought about this kind of thing. Like, have you gotten anywhere with it?
I remember the famous picture of, I forget where it was, I think it was Iraq somewhere, and there was a body. And a few photographers had pretty much the same picture. And then someone took a picture 5 steps back of 15 photographers fighting to take a picture of the body. And that felt predatory. And that felt, really ugly. I regret not taking the picture with them because I'd spent a whole day with them and spoken to them at great length. And I've had similar experiences now in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I really think they wanted their story to be told properly. And I failed to do that, thinking I was being polite. And actually, I think in that case, once you've spent enough time with them, they're not doing it because they think it's what you want. You're sure it's what they want. I think I should have taken the picture in that case. I think if you're there long enough, you've built up a relationship, you've built up trust, you're as sure as you can be that they're telling you what they want rather than what they think you want them to say. Then I think you should take the picture.
Yeah, but it's very, ultimately, because it's confusing, morally confusing, emotionally confusing, many journalists wind up with a kind of moral hangover from covering war. And that's probably a healthy response, but it's certainly a painful one. And I don't really know what the answer is, it's complicated.
I've also had people come up to me and say, why are you here? You always come here, you take your pictures, you make your movies, you get paid. And how do you help us? And it's difficult to come up with an answer for that. I think the thing that I think keeps me going is if I quit tomorrow, it would make no difference whatsoever. But if everybody doing this quit tomorrow, it would make a huge difference. So if you console yourself with the fact that you're a small part of a big team who collectively are doing something important, I think that's all there is really. When I started doing this, I think I had a belief that the right book and the right film could change the world. Yeah. I'm not so sure that's true. Every now and again one comes along that really breaks through and gets seen by people who would never normally engage in that subject. Most of the time now it feels like you're preaching to the choir.
In Sarajevo there was one bit of footage. A mortar had landed in an open market and killed and wounded 68 people, something like these civilians trapped in this city. And the footage was, people without legs crawling towards the cameraman, screaming for help. Just the worst kind of footage. And it finally triggered the beginning of NATO intervention that eventually ended the war. So it was a part of the solution. But it's one of the few times where you can draw a very clear line between the crime, the documenting of the crime, and then action by the world by the West, by NATO, that brings the crime to an end. I mean, but it's actually very, very rare to see it that clearly delineated.
I mean, the counter to that story is I did a film called This Is What Winning Looks Like, where I went back to Sangin after it was handed over to the Afghan security forces, and without exaggerating, the police were kidnapping, murdering, drug-addicted child abusers, and admitted to all this on camera. And I put this film out, and it won a couple of awards, and it got seen by millions of people. A year later, a friend of mine was in Kabul and got shown this classified NATO document with a chart about what was going to happen over the next year or two. You know, the steps of progress, steps to victory. And it was called This Is What Winning Looks Like. And my friend laughed and said, oh, you're joking, that's because of the film, right? And the guy said, no, what film? And genuinely it was called This Is What Winning Looks Like, and they thought they'd mapped it out.
Next one. All right.
So I should tee this one up. This is so Marjah was the biggest operation of the entire war. 30,000 troops invaded. Massive promises were made. Government in a box was going to be delivered. The Afghan government and security forces were going to take over, and this was going to be the model that was going to win the entire war in Afghanistan. I went back 5 years later. In fact, I say this in the intro here, but yeah, this is what I found 5 years later.
Billions were spent here and many lives were lost. I didn't expect things to be perfect, but 5 years on, what I found was shocking. The government in a box never really arrived, so these boys, aged 10, 12 and 14, have to fight and defend their village.
That's just an extraordinary and confusing situation. That's incredible.
And Marjah has fallen to the Taliban in the last month or so as well. And they fled to Lashkar, the provincial capital. So they're alive.
And why, do you know just personally why they chose to oppose rather than join the Taliban? Like what gets a family or a village to make that decision?
I mean, I don't know specifics. Certainly in Marjah and Sangin, a lot of it was the opium trade, and it was, you know, rival opium traffickers. I mean, Sangin was chosen based on 2 rival drug trafficking gangs. Specifically why they didn't join the Taliban, I don't know.
Where are the grown men? I mean,
there were some grown men there, not many. Her husband was the commander of that Afghan local police unit, but he just wasn't decisive. He wasn't enough of a leader, so she took it upon herself just to take over. You know, he wasn't killed. She sacked him. Yeah.
Can you sack your husband? I guess you can.
In Afghanistan, I thought that was absolutely impossible. You know, I mean, that really is exceptional to see that. I mean, for a number of reasons, but to see a woman taking over like that in southern Afghanistan, probably the most conservative part of Afghanistan, is incredible.
So there's different kinds of danger. You know, one kind of danger is walking with U.S. Marines through a village that's heavily mined, or being in a firefight. Another very different kind of danger is being on your own in a civilian population, and you don't entirely know if you're going to be given up for, you're going to be given up to the enemy, to the Taliban for a price, or if you're going to get caught in a Taliban attack, surrounded by villagers who you don't know very, like, can you talk about those different kinds of dangers and how you deal with them psychologically? Were you worried that you were going to be betrayed when you were there?
Several times. I mean, you know, no matter how many times, I've been to Afghanistan 14 or 15 times now, and it's very easy to feel completely exposed, completely out of your depth, the exact opposite of streetwise. You know, you can find yourself in situations just think, I'm lost here. I'm at anybody's mercy. A friend of mine has been covering Syria for the last few years and had a very good relationship with the rebel commander, considered him his friend. And they would Skype each other when my friend was back in London. On his recent trip, they went out, they got some great pictures. On the way home, the rebel commander got an offer or something changed, and he took them hostage. The fixer and him and his photographer tied them up, put them in a boot of a car. The fixer beat one of them with a rock and managed to escape. They were still in the boot of a car with their wrists tied. I don't know exactly what happened. There was a very nasty fight. Some other rebels came to help and free them. But before the rebel who was about to sell them left, he shot them in the ankles. And my friend said, to be honest, I see his logic. You know, we'd been back and forth for 2 years, taking all these pictures. The Syrians had said, show the world what's being done to us, and the world will save us. And nothing happened. So he thought, if I sell these guys and I get $100,000, I can buy new weapons for my guys, and you'll finally be actually helping us. And the way he described that logic and understood that logic, I thought was chilling. And the big fear used to be IEDs and the loss of your legs or worse. Now the big fear is appearing in one of these videos that we've all seen so many times. And thinking of your parents seeing that video, and that's the really frightening thing now.
Yeah, I mean, my encounters with fear, which you have to deal with fear if you're going to report on war. When I've been with U.S. forces, it could be very, very scary, but because it's not a solo experience, it's a group experience. Even if you don't know those guys that well, you're having a group experience. And just the fact that you're not alone makes it, for me, made it so much better. Being in a sort of moderate amount of danger, but by yourself, to me is incredibly terrifying. I feel like psychologically you're capable of a lot more courage when you're standing with other people who are in the same situation that you can trust.
And when you're with US forces, things might get bad, someone might step on an IED, someone might get shot, but they're probably going to come out on top. They're probably not going to get overrun and all get wiped out. That's very unlikely to happen. The other situation, you never know. I mean, what I find is the 2 or 3 days before you leave, you can't eat right, you can't sleep right, because you're imagining everything that can happen. And now I've joined Vice, I have to take a cameraman with me because they want me to be a correspondent. So I'm also, and the guy that filmed the film in Marjah, I've met his wife, I know his mum and dad, so I'm thinking, what about going home and having to have the conversation with them about what happened, and there's that as well. But when you're actually on the ground, once you've actually got there, your curiosity just takes over. And for me, it's not a case of being scared and going anywhere. You're so curious to see these things and record these things that overrides any fears you have for your own safety. And if you spend enough time in these places, you think, dipping my toes into these people's worlds for a month here and there is kind of tough. But imagine living there, and imagine trying to raise a family there and knowing you've got no way of getting out, or having to fight every day there just to survive. That makes visiting for a month here and there seem like not such an ordeal.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, want to do the next one?
The remaining 350 favelas that have not been pacified by the government and are not ruled by militias are completely in the hands of the drug gangs. Their control over these neighborhoods is absolute. Traffickers can import, cut, and bag huge amounts of drugs without fear.
So how did you get access to that world? It seems kind of extraordinary you seem very relaxed and at home there. And what was the previous record amount of cocaine you saw before that?
I don't know where that line came from. We had a fixer who was a former trafficker, and he introduced us to another gang, and we went to hang out with him. We got led, it was like a scene from a movie. We got led through all these checkpoints in this dark neighborhood and sat down with him while 16 of his men were bagging coke. And I told him some Afghanistan stories, and we got along very well. And he said, okay, I like you can come back tomorrow and film. And he even said, someone messed up, we're going to cut him up. You can film it if you want. And I said no, because I thought he might have been doing it, to show off to us. He was actually raided the following night by BOPE, the police special forces in Rio, so we never got access to that gang, but we met another, and it's just, sometimes I think being at Vice helps, because some of these guys have seen Vice, and so they want to be on Vice, and they like some of the things that they've seen on Vice before, so that helps. But apart from that, it's really the same methods we've always used, just spend a lot of time hanging around without the cameras out, building trust. In this case, they wanted to show how corrupt the government was and how little the government was doing for the poor, and how actually the poor were being pushed out to these violent neighborhoods in anticipation of the Olympics and the World Cup. So if there's a reason like that they want to show what's happening, you can normally persuade them to show you other stuff that maybe they were more reluctant to show.
How long were you there altogether on this story?
3 weeks, two and a half weeks, something like that.
A lot of people who aren't in the journalism business don't realize how crucial fixtures are to the job. And for me, certainly, I think for most journalists, my name goes on my report. The name that doesn't go on the report is whatever fixer I was working with in whatever country I was in. And they are this sort of like hidden, this sort of unseen quantity, this unseen thing that journalism wouldn't really be possible without. Can you want to talk a little bit about the relationship with fixers and how important it is?
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. They're essential. And they also live there. So, you know, those guys said, you can film us, but don't show our faces. Had we have shown our faces, they would have gone knocking on a fixer's door. And again, you know, people talk, we spoke earlier about, you know, overcoming fear and being brave and going to these places. For local journalists and fixers, that takes real bravery. When the people you're filming know where you live and know where your family live. And if you look at the journalists who are killed annually, the majority are local journalists. So, you know, again, that's another reason to sort of think whatever trials and tribulations I might go through, it's not that big a deal compared to what they're doing. I mean, we're trying to make fixers, if they want to be, often they don't want to be, if they want to be, you know, an acknowledged part of the team, we try and make that happen now. And that's happening more and more. And, you know, I always think no matter how hard I work on any country, I'll never understand it as well as someone who lived there and grew up there. So if eventually they can do it on their own, then I'm all for that.
Was that a particularly frightening assignment, or was that all right?
It was. I mean, when they were cutting the coke, there were two guys got into a really nasty argument, and they both had assault rifles around their necks and both been snorting coke all night. So that was, yeah, that was very testy. And also, you know, I first went to Rio when I was 19 years old, I think. I was a vegetarian who didn't drink and was very shy with women. And I went to Rio, and everything changed. Like it was, you know.
It fixed all three problems.
Yeah. So I had this love affair with Rio. I just thought it was the best place on earth. And I went back and I just saw this other side to it where, I mean, you know, if you live in Ipanema and if you're a descendant of a European in Rio, then yes, you can live this golden life. Mostly white Brazilians live there. You go 2 miles up the hill where poor black Brazilians live. And the violence and the, you know, I mean, it really ruined my love affair with Rio, and I look at it in a completely different way now. I mean, the fire department, for some reason, pick up bodies from the favelas. So we met this fireman, and we wanted to spend a couple of days filming with him, and we did, and we saw him picking up several bodies. He called us every day and night. I've got another body here, another body here. One body 2 blocks away from Copacabana Beach.
And these were victims of violence.
Yeah, drug-related violence. Yeah, or, you know, rival drug trafficking violence.
Next one.
If you captured me or either of my friends, what would you do?
أقتله دون أي تردد.
So another relaxing vacation in the Middle East, in other words.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you, I mean, the obvious question is, how is it you sat down with people? How did you arrange to sit down with people who said they would kill you if they could? How does that work?
They were actually prisoners in Kurdistan. And the Kurds are treating their prisoners very well. The Red Cross had been to that prison, the UN had been. So, you know, we could have done the same thing in Baghdad, and I was sure the opposite would have been true, and they would have been tortured there and would have been told to say, you know, whatever the Shiite militias or whoever it was had captured them, wanted them to say. So once we thought we could talk to them freely, it wasn't actually that difficult. I interviewed 3 of them in the end. The first 2 confirmed what we'd been told across Iraq, which was that life under the Maliki government was so bad, if you weren't Shiite, that when ISIS first came along, they were welcomed. I mean, Christian refugees told us that when ISIS first came along, they thought they were fantastic, and the only people that could protect them from the Maliki government. And you know, they would greet them in the street and buy and sell food with them, and then it changed over the period of time. The third guy interviewed, the guy you see in the clip there, was, you know, ideologically 100% committed. And I'd said to myself before we did the interviews, I don't want to shake hands with these guys because, you know, they've killed journalists, they've killed aid workers and others. And the question right at the end was a kind of throwaway question that they were rushing us to finish the interview, and I just said, what would you do if you captured me or one of my friends here? Spencer was one of those friends. And he said, I would kill you without hesitation, just like we killed those other journalists. And then he got up, shook my hand, and my hand just automatically came out to shake hands with him, and he said, "I wish we had more time to speak." And I actually think that he thinks, had he have had more time with me, he had a chance of converting me. I mean, he was that sure he was right, and that sure that what he was doing was prophecy and was leading to the big grand final battle and the end of days. I mean, 100% convinced.
Can you help us understand a little bit more the sort of mentality of ISIS? They seem like such a nihilistic, brutal organization. They have their own logic and philosophy, obviously. From the outside, it doesn't look like they do. But so, I mean, do you have insights into ISIS that we might not have since we haven't had your experiences?
I mean, not much more than I've already said. I think some of them, I mean, some of the Anbar tribes we were with in Iraq defected not long after we were with them, just as a matter of survival. It was that or literally have your head handed to you. But certainly interviewing him, I think there are, and I don't know what the proportion is between people who join for pragmatic reasons and people who join for ideological reasons. I mean, certainly the evidence is, we did another film with ISIS about a year ago now, and there are lots of people from America and Europe going over there thinking this is the way they should live. And in a small town in Syria, this is where the big final battle and Judgment Day will happen. I don't know what proportion is, which is which. I mean, in an interview with Ryan Crocker, which you don't see in that clip, he said something which, something that Bush would have said. I think every conflict in the world, we all know roughly what the political solution looks like. Israel, Palestine, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kashmir. We know roughly what the deal should be. I don't know what the political solution is with ISIS. And he said, well, Ben, some people, the only thing you can do is kill them. And normally, something like that, a Bush-Cheney type quote, you'd argue back. And I honestly didn't have much of an answer for it. I mean, is a political solution we leave them in control of Raqqa and Mosul and other places where they throw homosexuals off roofs and make young girls sex slaves, and I don't think we should be comfortable with that.
I mean, that's a really huge dilemma, a huge question for the West, is at what point do you ignore war crimes and say it's actually more immoral to fight these people than to let them do what they're doing? And I mean, the West struggled with that in Bosnia for 3 years. There was effectively a genocide in Bosnia, and the West didn't do anything. And some people at the time, I grew up in a really liberal family. It was very anti-war, but I'd been in Bosnia, so I'd seen it from the other side. But I remember my sort of liberal friends saying, no, war is immoral. I mean, war is not the answer. And I'm like, okay, all right, war isn't the answer, but then what is the answer to genocide? I mean, what are you proposing? And I don't know what the answer is myself, obviously, but it's a very complicated moral calculation that the West has to make in a situation that they probably could affect if they tried to. And neither political party, conservatives, liberals, really has the answer. I mean, I'm not even sure there is an answer, but it's a very painful question.
I'm not sure there is an answer, but I think, to simplify things slightly, I think the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan could be it's decades before we intervene anywhere. And there is no simple solution to ISIS in Syria and Iraq, but I think most people would agree that we should have intervened in Rwanda. If Rwanda happened again in the next few months, right, I think a lot of people would argue against intervention because of how badly Iraq and Afghanistan turned out. And I think that would be a real tragedy if no intervention under any circumstances was the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan.
That was the first one, so we'll go with her. I'm going to walk around and feel free to, if you guys could share that mic, that'd be great. And if you just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Why do I need to introduce myself? Nobody cares about me. No, you don't. My name is Lara, and I'm wondering what incident keeps you awake at night?
What incident?
What incident that you endured doing your job? What keeps you awake at night?
I mean, so far, touch wood, nothing. I mean, what I could do next keeps me awake at night, I think. So far, there's nothing. I mean, my big fear when I started doing this was, when I first started doing it, I met a few other people who'd been doing it for a very long time. And they were bitter, very badly damaged alcoholics or drug abusers, or, I'm sure you've experienced people like that. And I was so scared of becoming like that. And I could see how easy it would be to become like that. So far, I've gone the exact opposite direction. So far, I appreciate the tiniest little things far more than I ever did before. I know it sounds cliche. I go between two different states of mind. Sometimes everything is boring in comparison to seeing these things and doing these things, and everything feels trivial compared to covering some of these issues. But then sometimes I walk out and buy a newspaper and a cup of coffee and think, it's so amazing. I can walk out and buy a paper and a cup of coffee, and I don't know which one I'm going to end up being permanently, but I hope it's the latter.
I actually have a follow-up question for that. Have you thought about the day when you may get out of the business and why you might? I mean, have you thought forward to the end of this part of your life?
Yeah, I think about it all the time. I thought about it before this event because I don't know what the end point is now. I think the end point is keep on going until something happens to me or something happens to someone very close to me. And I don't know if I want that to be the end point. Maybe there's a time to call it quits before that. But at the same time, I can't think of anything else. This is the only thing I've ever done or ever wanted to do where I feel vaguely useful. And I can't think of anything else. I mean, I'd love to be a doctor but it's a bit late for that now, I suspect. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not married. I haven't got kids. I think if I got married and had kids, and if my wife had a real problem with it, I think maybe that would be the time, because you can still cover these issues without being the guy that is at the front of the patrol walking through the alley with IEDs. You can tamp it down a bit. But then I also know, I mean, the only reason I wasn't in amongst those IEDs when they went off was because I'd betrayed a promise that I made to my mum. My mum accepts that I do this now, and she said, look, Ben, just don't be at the front of these patrols all the time. Just hang back a bit. You don't have to be at the front. I said, okay, Mum, I'll do that. And then on these patrols, I was straight to the front filming the guy with the metal detector, and because of that, I wasn't on the corner when all 7 IEDs went off, so you never know.
Hi, I'm Bailey. I was wondering how you decide when you're on the ground what angle of your story to go after and how much of that truth you decide to tell, or which truth to tell, the whole or a single.
I mean, I try not to at all. I'll read everything I possibly can, but I'll go out there fully prepared to reject most of it and find out something completely different. I mean, This Is What Winning Looks Like film I told you about, I knew it'd be bad when we handed over to the Afghan police and army in Sangin. I had no idea it'd be that bad. I had no idea I could get a police commander admitting to child abuse on camera. So I think sometimes the most dangerous thing is to read a bunch of articles before you go out there and plan the really clever thing you're going to say or the clever question you're going to ask, and then just regurgitate what you read from home. The most dangerous thing would be to miss something happening off to the side. So I think you have to go out there. I mean, my hero in journalism is George Orwell, and I'll probably get the quote wrong, but it's something like the constant struggle is to see what's right in front of your nose. And I think that's the best thing, is to go out there trying to look at everything with fresh eyes, because there aren't that many people now get to go to somewhere like Marjah or Sangin and hang around for 5 or 6 weeks. So, the point of that should be to actually find out what's going on, then report, rather than try and decide what the story is beforehand. So that's why I think as small a team as possible and as much time as possible on the ground is essential. And I've moved to the States 2.5 years ago, and you see a lot of American news, and they'll go out there for 2 or 3 days, and they have to do a live stand-up every 15 minutes, and it just makes actual reporting almost impossible, especially if you've got 2 cameras, lights, sound, producer, satellite feed back to New York or DC, wherever. So yeah, I try and just I mean, I always wanted to be a writer more than a documentary maker, so I always try and act like a writer, just blend in to the background and hang around for as long as possible and just soak up what's actually happening, and then you'll find out that what's actually happening is probably far more interesting than what you'd read about before you actually went out there.
No, I'm good.
Hi, I'm Zach. I cover the Pentagon. I'm curious, there's been a renewed focus, I think, on traumatic brain injury. But the other side of that is the psychological impact of constantly being under threat. something you could go back to the Vietnam War and see because of booby traps, et cetera, that had an impact on those veterans. I'm curious, how much do you see the psychological toll versus the physiological toll of traumatic brain injury as having an impact on veterans in the US and the ongoing issues that we're facing, whether it be depression or suicide, et cetera, that we're seeing in astronomical numbers among veterans?
And I don't know the link between PTSD and traumatic brain injury and what happened since, but I know that, there's a former Marine, now journalist, here tonight who I was with in Marjah, and we were talking earlier, I think 7 or 8 people from Marjah have since died. Some suicides, but some just doing crazy things. Whether they were doing crazy things before they went to Afghanistan, I don't know, because only a certain kind of person signs up to be an infantryman and go and fight the Taliban or whoever. But yeah, I think coming home to a country that isn't even aware of what they went through, or coming home and reading the news that ISIS just took the town you fought for, I think that's having a huge effect. You probably...
Yeah, I've written a little bit about this, and I should say, obviously, journalists get PTSD as well. And civilians here in the United States who are in a bad car accident. Trauma affects everybody, and unfortunately, trauma eventually comes to everybody. And so that kind of traumatic reaction is it's part of life for most people. But I have written a little bit about this, and it's exceedingly complicated. But one of the predictors of everyone immediately after a traumatic event, virtually everyone's traumatized. It's short-term PTSD. Chronic long-term PTSD is about 20% of the population who are exposed to trauma wind up with a condition that goes on and on for months and years, or even a lifetime. And it seems to be, I studied anthropology in college, and I had this idea that I did my field work on the Navajo reservation in Arizona back in the 80s. And I had this, the Navajo very warlike. Most of the American Indian tribes in North America had a very strong tradition of war. And I just had this idea. I was like, I bet the Navajo and the Apache and the Comanche were not getting PTSD. They would go out and fight the U.S. cavalry or each other, and I bet when they came back, they're pretty much psychologically intact. And so why does the U.S. have such a high rate of PTSD? In Israel, it's something around 1%. Way, way lower than we have. And the idea that I had was that if you come back to a cohesive, community-oriented society, you get over PTSD faster. You also probably have lower rates of depression and suicide and all that. And so I started to look into it, and that is exactly the case. And one of the problems, in World War II in this country, even 2 generations ago in World War II, it was a more cohesive society compared to now. There also wasn't, I think, this terrible sense of futility. We won World War II, right? There was a threat to the world as we saw it, and at enormous cost, we stopped that threat, and the guys came home. Our soldiers came home. And now the nature of warfare is way more ambiguous. And I'm not even saying we should or shouldn't be fighting these wars. I don't really have an opinion about that. But certainly the outcome is ambiguous. And I think that ambiguity leads to very, very high levels of PTSD. And the nature of our society is just hard on everybody. And certainly people who are psychologically vulnerable, like people who have just come out of combat in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Hi. Just watching the clips, which were really interesting, and of course, obviously taken out of a larger kind of narrative context, there was a really wide variation in terms of the actual cinematic presentation, how much music is used, what is the visual aspects. And in particular, I noticed that I think it was the last one, where you interviewed the guy from ISIS in Iraq, was much more kind of heightened in that aspect. And so I was wondering, in your work with Vice, have you found that those kind of presentation choices are different? And also just how do you think about that when you're taking everything that you've gotten in the field and kind of trying to turn it into something to present?
I mean, the clip you saw was a trailer, so it feels like a trailer. Hopefully the final film doesn't feel like we're trying to make it look like a Hollywood blockbuster. I think my footage, when I was shooting alone, those were the days when you had a small digital camera and you could get away with substance over style. So some of it was out of focus, some of it was wobbly, but if you were in the right place getting incredible footage, you could get away with it. Now, with 5Ds and everything else, you can't get away with it anymore. The standard is so much higher now than it was 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. And with Vice, that's why the quality of the footage suddenly improves, because they give me a cameraman who's very good and shoots on a C300. If your question is the difficulties about going too far overboard, I've never had pressure to sensationalize or make it seem worse than it was. And hopefully the style of the presentation, sometimes I even downplay things slightly because I'm so afraid of over-egging it and exaggerating. But that's in the eye of the beholder, I guess.
Hi, my name is Ben. Thank you both for being here this evening. My question, since we've heard so much about human depravity, what is the greatest display of human compassion that you've seen while in the field, and why has that had such a great effect on you?
I mean, every time you see incredible acts of generosity and kindness, and often I think the worse a country's reputation is, the kinder and more hospitable the people seem to be. I did a film in Afghanistan last summer, I think it was, about the NGO called Emergency, set up by an Italian heart surgeon, and they operate in the worst areas of Afghanistan, and there are Italians and other Europeans, but they train Afghans to eventually take over. And I spent almost a month with them, filming them, working, sometimes 16, 17 hours a day, doing 20 surgeries a day. And when I could, I'd interview them between surgeries, and I'd say, how do you keep going? This is your country, this is your home, you're seeing this horror every day. You're sleeping 3 hours a night, you're not eating. And they looked at me like I was an idiot. Like, we're doctors, this is what we do. How can I get tired when all these people need help? And that's, the most extraordinary bravery I've ever seen. And, I'm a tourist, I'm there for a month, this is their home. Some of the head surgeon in the film about Emergency was from Marjah. And he dropped that in at the end of the interview and said, by the way, I'm from Marjah. How do you even become a doctor? If you're from Marjah, let alone keep going the way they did. But I don't know if you've had the same experience, but I think what keeps you going is for every act of cruelty and violence you see a dozen acts of the most unbelievable kindness, which is why it's so shocking now to see, even liberals like Bill Maher and people like that saying things about Muslims that Sarah Palin would say. Because, having traveled to lots of these countries, it's just the complete opposite of the truth.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've been asked, isn't it depressing to cover war? And occasionally it is. And it actually became really dismally depressing after my friend Tim was killed, and that's why I stopped. But mostly, in the wars that I've covered, mostly what you understand about human beings is that they're for the most part incredibly brave and generous, and it's in a context of violence, yes, but within that context, people their generosity, even towards a stranger like a journalist, is absolutely extraordinary. And I would say, as you said, the worse the circumstances, in some ways the better people act. I was in Sarajevo during the war, and I went back last summer, the first time in 20 years, and I was amazed to find civilians who missed the war. And I was sort of used to U.S. airborne infantry missing firefights. These are testosterone-filled guys who kind of miss combat. I get it. I wasn't prepared for civilians, people who had been teenagers during the siege, to say, we really missed the war. And I asked about it, and this one woman said to me, what we miss, a fifth of the city was killed or wounded during that siege. 1 out of 5 people. And she said, we were better people then. We were more generous. We stuck together. We were just better human beings. And now we're wealthy, we have our own lives, we're cool, and we're not as good as we were. And she said that there was a piece of graffiti in Sarajevo that said, things were better when they were bad. And that's one of the sort of poignant ironies of humans, is that when things get bad, human beings are capable of incredibly good actions. And as things get better, and this is where you get PTSD in modern society, as things get better and people live more and more individualistic lives, that's great on one level, but it actually leads to real mental and spiritual distress. It's the irony of wealthy modern society.
I was wondering, we've talked about the process of building trust, and I was wondering how much of that actually feels fundamentally dishonest. Because I think a lot of the people you must be trying to build trust and rapport with are people who maybe you have the same fundamental values with, but there must be a lot of small crimes overlooked in the process of getting the story that you want to tell. And I wonder if either of you, if you have your own personal framework for how much you'll go along with and how much you won't. Like you mentioned, you didn't want to shake this person's hand. Like, what are your personal lines in the sand? How does it feel to be building trust with someone who you might not actually trust yourself? And has it ever come back to bite you, this sort of putting on this face of developing a relationship that might not be a very honest relationship on your part?
I read, I forget the name of the author now, the famous New Yorker piece, The Journalist and the Subject or something it's called. I'm sure some of you have read it. And she said the whole thing is a betrayal. You're setting someone up to be betrayed. I've honestly never felt that way. I mean, the Rio drug traffickers, we were filming them trafficking drugs. We were filming them controlling a whole neighborhood with violence. The ISIS film we did, we showed all of their crimes. We showed them, terrorizing people on the streets for the material on their clothes being a bit too translucent. So honestly, and everyone I've made a film of. I mean, my first ever film, I spent 5 months undercover as an undertaker, wearing a secret camera and working in a funeral home, filming all of the scams that go on in the funeral business in the UK. And I never did it, but the thing, because you're lying to people every day, I mean, that really was a betrayal. The thing that kept me going throughout was, if I bumped into any one of these people on the street after the film went out, I could look them in the eye and say, you have to admit that was a really good, important, solid, fair story. And honestly, I've always, I don't want to sound like I'm on my high horse or anything, but I've always felt that way so far. I've never lied to anyone or set someone up to fail. And if I'm filming someone who's guilty of something, then I'm normally filming the thing they're guilty of. I'm not hiding it to get to something else, or I haven't done so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated, but I think you can do this job. In fact, I think it simplifies this job if you are just honest with everybody. That doesn't mean, I mean, there's honest and there's impolitic. And I mean, I don't think anyone goes out of their way to offend someone whose help they need, just, whatever. I mean, we all know that situation in our personal lives. And the thing about journalism, even in really kind of radical places like this, is it's the same interpersonal skills you use, when you take the bus, right? Or when you go get groceries, or with your friends. I mean, ethics are the same, interpersonal skills are the same. Do you lie in your personal life? Yeah, sometimes, to spare someone's feelings, whatever. Like, this isn't a radically different world. It's the same human world that we all inhabit here. The stakes are just higher. But I wouldn't say that I have ever changed into a different kind of person because now I'm on assignment and I'm going to get this thing. Like, that actually, I think, doesn't work very well. It's very hard to be to betray who you are and to keep that going for very long. It's very, very hard to do. People see through it immediately. And the thing that people do always trust is authenticity. If they feel like you're not concealing anything, and if you're honest about, listen, I would say this to the soldiers sometimes. I'm like, look, I grew up in a liberal household during Vietnam. I was raised in a very anti-war environment, and I'm a Democrat. Like, that offended the sensibilities of probably 70% of the soldiers I with, but they liked me personally, and one of the reasons they liked me, because I wasn't pretending to be politically aligned the way they were. That was one of the things I think they actually liked about me.
Mr. Putzel?
Thank you. My name is Michael Putzel, and I spent 2.5 years covering the war in Vietnam. And first of all, I'd just like to say that the comments you made about the Marine Corps were the same there. They were always the best to go with, to be with, and they produced great stories, and I think it's still working for them. However, my question is somewhat different, and more to what Sebastian was saying about the after effects of war. It seems to me that I don't know how well we are watching what's happening to people coming home now. Certainly 100 times more or 1,000 times more than they did coming home from Vietnam. Nobody was looking for it, nobody saw it. But do you see among correspondents like yourselves this same difficulty of trying to relate back to the people you work with and know and love? When you've been there and come back, can they understand? Can you talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for myself. I had an enormously hard time transitioning back. I had tremendous psychological burdens that I wasn't even aware of, and they came and they got particularly acute after Tim was killed. And Tim wasn't killed next to me in combat. Tim was killed on an assignment that we were both supposed to be on. I had to stay home for personal reasons. He got killed, and I just made it my fault in my head. And I suddenly understood the soldiers that I talked to, who they all blamed themselves for the deaths of their friends, even if quite obviously there was no rational reason to do that. And I was married at the time, and I got incredibly depressed. I didn't know it was PTSD. I mean, I just, I didn't even know I was depressed. But what I experienced was I felt like a ghost in my life. I felt like I didn't exist and people couldn't interact with me because I wasn't really there. That's what it felt like. And I was so puzzled. And it's very, that's particularly painful if that's happening within your marriage. I mean, then you really feel doomed. And, my marriage ended partly because of that dynamic. I could not get on top of it. And so I think journalists, soldiers, it's all the same human psyche, and you come home, and I think one of the most painful things that can happen to people who have been traumatized is this feeling of psychic distance from everyone they love. I mean, you don't need to feel connected to the people you're with on the bus, but if you feel like your wife is actually a stranger, that's devastating. And I think that's I found out later, as I sort of put my mind to this and tried to heal myself, it's a really, really common reaction.
I mean, I haven't been through anything like that yet. I think there's a danger it's all being suppressed, and I'm not aware of things. I don't know, but I mean, I think I'd like to know how you got through it and how you got over it.
Well, the thing is, this is what happens. You think you don't have a problem, and then meanwhile, the problem is affecting your life, right? I mean, that's what happened with me. So in the depths of my depression, I would have said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with me. My wife looks like a complete stranger to me, but I don't feel like anything's wrong. And it's a very strange sort of split awareness. And part of it was just time. I mean, I got out of war reporting. I talked to someone about it, with a professional, and I did a lot of thinking. And also, alcohol can play a big role in this. And I also stopped drinking. And I didn't even drink particularly much. But if you deal with your feelings by drinking, you're actually not dealing with your feelings, right? You're sending in a substitute to deal with your feelings, which is a great thing to do. I mean, it actually really works. But eventually, you have to go into that room with your feelings and deal with them eventually. And it may not be till you're 70. I mean, but those feelings are waiting for you. Like eventually they're gonna come mug you. And I kind of got mugged when Tim got killed, and all this stuff caught up with me. And that actually started the beginning of a real sort of psychological cleaning house for me of 15 years of pretty intense reporting.
Yeah, I mean, at the minute, I still think by instinct, I'm just witnessing other people suffering. So that's how I compartmentalize it. I kind of think it's, whatever I'm feeling is nothing compared to what I'm witnessing. And for people who are fighting, I think, I sometimes think it's almost like I'm entering a boxing ring, hoping the other guy doesn't show up. Because I don't have to be in a position where my actions determine whether this goes well or badly. I just watch other people make those decisions and perform those actions that could save the day, could turn out to be a complete disaster. So as long as I'm just witnessing things, it's easy to step back. But I also recognize, some of the things you described. So I don't know.
Actually, the idea is that experiencing danger is traumatic, and it can be. But my experience and in the literature, witnessing the pain of others is actually really the most profoundly traumatic thing there is. I have a petty question for you. I've been admiring your shirt. It's exactly like a shirt that I have. My mother gave it to me for Christmas. Did your mother give you that shirt? You went out and bought it. Okay, all right. Well, you and my mother have identical taste. And I actually almost wore it tonight, so thank God.
Your last clip was in Kurdistan, and it seems like there's been some reporting that there have been kind of hopeful developments in Kurdistan, that there's this kind of left project happening amongst the Kurds, that they are building this kind of egalitarian, leftist, progressive society in some way. There's the reports of the kind of egalitarian fighting force, including lots of women at the front. I don't know whether that was what you were covering when you were in Kurdistan, but if you can speak to that, some of the truths and myths about that, that would be great. Thank you.
I think if you're looking for good guys in the region, then the Kurds are definitely the good guys in that region. I mean, I was recently there, and we went to Anbar province and Baghdad, and then went from Baghdad to Erbil. And it's like going from Gaza to Paris. Women walk around uncovered if they want to be. Christians are free to worship as they choose. Prisoners are treated well. And the idea is that they're supported through the government in Baghdad, because the whole idea of the post-Saddam project was the government in Baghdad represents everybody. That's not happening. Baghdad is actually withholding the funds from the Kurds. They're getting help now from some US special forces, from airstrikes. They've got some Milan rockets from Germany, but they're getting nowhere near the support they should be getting. And they've had more success against ISIS than anybody else. And I really don't think that will come back to haunt us one day. The Shiite militias have had success against ISIS. That could well come back to haunt us one day. I don't think they're that different to ISIS, even though they're far less known than ISIS. But no, I think most of what's written about the Kurds is absolutely true in my experience.